Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to move along to the next chapter of the Baronet textbook, chapter 6. This explores a branch of categorical logic known as categorical syllogisms. We are going to be building off of the previous knowledge we've acquired in chapter 5 in particular. So if you are in any way still uncomfortable with some of the tools we've acquired throughout that chapter, you should certainly go back and make sure you are comfortable with Venn diagrams and the moves we can make called immediate inferences. I will review that a little bit here briefly before moving on, but you should be aware that we are going to be building on previously acquired skill sets, so you should really make sure you have those under your belt before watching this video. So, categorical logic or categorical syllogisms, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about here. But before we do, let's just have a very quick review of our Venn diagrams for some of our immediate inferences. Remember, we discussed the transformation we're allowed to make in our categorical sentence types, conversion, switches subject and predicate, and on the modern interpretation, to switch subject and predicate yields this set of transformations on the Venn diagram. When we're looking for the validly convertible propositions, we look for the diagrams that are identical or equivalent, and you can see that our E proposition, no S or P, can validly be converted to no P or S, and our particular affirmative proposition, the I proposition, some S or P, can validly be converted to some P or S. Those are said to be equivalent or essentially saying the same thing. However, we do not have valid conversion for our A proposition, the universal affirmative, all S or P, on the modern interpretation, because the modern interpretation denies existential import for universal class terms. And so to say all S or P is not the same thing as saying all P or S. That is different, however, on the traditional interpretation. Recall that the traditional or Aristotelian interpretation of logic allows us, through a process of subalternation, to limit the A proposition to the corresponding particular. Some S or P can then be validly converted as some P or S, and that is a valid move we can make, but we can't on the modern interpretation. For the O proposition, some S are not P, the particular negative. This is an invalid conversion. We see the X over in region 3, so we have a clear difference between the O proposition and its converted inference. So that's not an inference we're allowed to make. Okay, we then have obversion. Obversion, and this is appearing on page 203, involves two steps. First, we change the quality, and then we add the complement term, non, to the predicate of the sentence. Obversion allows us, is valid for all four types of categorical proposition. That's the good thing. And you'll see that each one of these Venn diagrams are logically equivalent. So obversion is a very forgiving and applicable immediate inference type. All right, and then last but not least, we have contraposition. This is appearing on page 204 of your textbook. Contraposition begins like conversion with switching S and P. We then add the complement term to both P and S. So we need non in front of P and S, but we don't change the quality when it comes to contraposition. So which categorical propositions can we validly contrapose? Well, the A proposition is identical here. All S or P becomes all non-P are non-S. So these are logically equivalent. That's a valid inference we can make. We cannot make a valid contraposition of the E proposition. No S or P becomes no non-P are non-S. That's not a move we can make. The I proposition, some S or P, this is the particular affirmative. This becomes some non-P are non-S, and so we have an X out in region 4. So this is not a valid contraposition either. The O proposition looks equivalent to me. Some S are not P becomes some non-P are not non-S. So this is a valid contraposition. So we're allowed to contrapose A propositions and O propositions on the modern interpretation. Do review at least a few more times before moving on how to make these moves on the four categorical types, and certainly be familiar with what their visual representations are on the Venn diagram. Okay. Okay, so moving along here with chapter 6, we are essentially working with some of the logical grammar that we've already really been building up to in chapter 5. So categorical syllogisms should be somewhat intuitive to you at this point if you're comfortable with our four types of categorical proposition. So in this video, I'd like to introduce a couple of topics to you in chapter 6. This appears in sections 8, B, and C. The first is to just kind of show you how the standard form syllogisms look in terms that will allow us to apply some of the tools that will test for validity. In section B, I will introduce the category of mood and figure to you. Okay, and then we will introduce the topic of diagramming the syllogisms in a future segment. All right, so in section A, we have just some technical verbiage here that gets us to an understanding of what a syllogism is. Now, we've actually worked with syllogisms before, very early on in the course. A syllogism is a type of deductive argument. Recall that deductive arguments are arguments where if we have true premises, it is completely impossible for the conclusion to be false. So a deductive argument proceeds with a kind of strict inferential flow. And a syllogism is a type of deductive argument. What distinguishes the syllogism from past deductive arguments that we looked at is that it's really an argument in 3 steps. A syllogism has 2 premises that set up the argument, and then it has that inferential moment where we draw a conclusion in a manner that is supported by the premises. All right. So here's a look at an example. The first premise reads, all comedians are funny people. The second sentence reads, some comedians are good actors. And then we have, for a conclusion, some good actors are funny people. And notice we are still going to be using our horizontal line to represent the portion that separates the premises from the conclusion. So two premises, and then we have our inferential leap here, and then we have our conclusion. So you might ask yourself a little bit before moving on, how do each one of these sentences fit on our square of opposition, right? What categories are these? The first sentence looks like a universal affirmative to me, right? That is an A proposition, where the subject term is comedians and the predicate term is funny people. And then we have a quality of affirmation. We are saying that all S are P here, right? So maybe just look over the sentence and try to pick up any patterns, which terms are repeating and how many times are they repeating. And for each sentence, which category of proposition can you identify? So just try to write down for yourself what category each sentence is before moving on. Okay, so what are the basic units or the basic ingredients, as it were, of a categorical syllogism? First, we should say there are 3 statements, right? 3 sentences, and they have to be complete sentences. We have our 4 types of categorical proposition: A, E, I, and O, universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. By now, those should be completely automatic for you. Those should be things you can rattle off in your sleep. All right. Now, if we consider for a moment that there are 3 sentences in a syllogism, and each sentence can be one of the 4 types of proposition. We know that there are 256 possible categorical syllogisms in terms of the category of proposition that can appear, the arrangement of proposition. So that's really a huge number of manifestations of a categorical syllogism. The good news is we have discovered some laws of validity that allow us in very quick ways to be able to identify whether or not a given categorical syllogism is valid or not, simply based on the formal and structural properties of the propositions. Okay, so like everything else in formal logic and symbolic logic, very quickly the content is going to become pretty irrelevant to whether or not an argument is valid. Much more of our concern is the relationship between the class terms and the arrangement of category types in terms of each other. All right, so categorical syllogisms all have certain commonly shared characteristics. We have 3 terms that occur 2 times. All right, you probably picked up on that in our example just given. 3 terms appearing twice. So there's a repetition of 3 different terms. So you can always count on that for every categorical syllogism you'll see. So if we look at our example again, I've highlighted the class terms in terms of their repetition. Our first sentence, again, is all comedians are funny people. Our second premise is some comedians are good actors. And then we have our horizontal line to indicate the inferential leap to the conclusion. The conclusion is some good actors are funny people. So try to pick up on the 3 terms. What are they? And where are their repetitions? I see comedians as the subject term in the first premise. That subject is repeated in the premise. Funny people appears as the predicate of the first premise, only to reappear again as the predicate in the conclusion. And then we have good actors as the predicate term of the second premise, appearing as the subject term of the conclusion. Okay, so 2 terms here, 3 terms repeating twice. Now we have names to designate each position of the class term in the categorical syllogisms. The minor term is going to always be the subject of the conclusion. The minor term to repeat is the subject of the conclusion in every categorical syllogism. So note that in this particular instance, good actors is the minor term. It is appearing as the subject of the conclusion. I think this is a little, this can be something that trips students up, because when we think of major and minor, we tend to want to think of major as being like more important. So one would expect the subject of the conclusion to be major, not minor. But no, the conclusion, the subject of the conclusion is known as the minor term. You should be very careful of that. The major term will be the predicate of the conclusion. Okay, so in this case, funny people is the predicate of the conclusion. So we know that that is our major term. And then we have what is known as a middle term. The middle term, I'm just using M to designate the middle term, is essentially the other repeating class term, the repeated class term that does not occur at all in the conclusion. And in this case, it's comedians. So comedians is appearing as the subject of the first premise and the subject of the second premise. But what defines it as the middle term is that it appears nowhere in the conclusion. Okay, so that's really how you're going to be able to pick up the middle term. It just does not appear at all in any class position of the conclusion. So we've got minor term, subject of the conclusion, major term, predicate of the conclusion, middle term is the repeating term that does not appear anywhere in the conclusion. Now have a look, just before moving on, where that minor term appears elsewhere in the syllogism. Looks like it appears as the predicate in the second premise, good actors. And then where does that major term, funny people, the predicate of the conclusion, appear elsewhere? I'm seeing it as the predicate of the first premise. So we have an interesting kind of configuration of class terms here, where the minor term appears as predicate and subject, and the major term appears as predicate twice, and the middle term appears as subject twice. Okay, so this is just an example of a standard breakdown of a categorical syllogism. Now, there are a set of requirements that any categorical syllogism has to meet in order to count as essentially a grammatical categorical syllogism. There are certain things for it to conform to in order for us to be able to identify whether or not it's a valid argument or not. The categorical syllogism must be in standard form. In other words, all of those sentences must meet the structure of standard form categorical propositions. It should either be an A, E, I, or O sentence. It can be any which one of those, but it has to be a universal affirmative or a universal negative or a particular affirmative or a particular negative. It has to conform into those four types of sentence that we've been learning about and that map on to the square of opposition. If our sentences don't seem to cleanly conform to the standard form, we might have to translate the sentence and clean up the class terms a little bit so that it does. And we're going to learn some techniques for cleaning up sentences to make them standard form in future videos. Second, the two occurrences of each term must be identical and have the same sense. In other words, the repetition of the terms must really be the same. They must mean the same content. All right, so this is one instance where categorical syllogisms are a little bit dependent on the content of the argument. The sense is that you can't have a repetition of two terms where in the second instance it means the complete opposite thing because of the context. All right, and there aren't really going to be any instances where you're sort of tricked into an opposite sentence here, but just beware that really the class terms have to be identical in structure and in meaning. The major premise must occur first and the minor premise second, and the conclusion has to occur last. So we're going to be calling the first premise moving forward the major premise, and the minor premise will be the second premise, and then there's that conclusion after the horizontal line. So we have names not only for all three of the terms and their placement, but we have names for each sentence as it occurs. So let's go back to our example here and just really get surgical with it. You will note that we have our major premise in red, and it's the major premise because it contains the major term. It contains funny people. And then we have as our second premise the minor premise because it contains the minor term, good actors. And then our conclusion, some good actors are funny people. We have minor term in the subject position and funny people in the predicate position. Okay, so I've highlighted the repetition of funny people in red, the repetition of the middle term, comedians, which is occurring in the subject position for both the major premise and the minor premise, and then good actors, which picks up the predicate position from the minor premise. Now you can kind of imagine how, given that we have four categories of proposition, really there's a huge kind of elaboration of types of categorical syllogism that could possibly appear, even with content that is pretty straightforward, right? And you can kind of start to pick up on how the validity of these arguments is not going to be at all contingent upon really thinking about the content of the premises, but rather about whether or not structurally conclusions are truly following from major and minor premises. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit here about what is known as the standard form. Okay, the basic features of syllogisms as we have unpacked them so far are: one, they contain three premises, each of which occurs in standard categorical form. Two, they have three terms, with the major term appearing in the first premise, the minor term in the second, and the middle term appearing in both premises. Three, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. Okay, that's not new information. I'm just compressing everything here so you have it consolidated. Now look very closely at this formalized example of a categorical syllogism at the bottom. Note this has no content at all. We are just looking at formal structure. All MRP appears to be the first premise. All SRM appears to be the second. And the conclusion reads all SRP. So remember what our major and minor term locations are, where our middle term is designated as with M, and how the major and the minor premises function. This is our major premise, right? All M are P. We then have our minor premise, all S are M, and then we have, our conclusion, all S are P. So also think, for yourself about what category proposition each one of these sentences is. You'll notice each one of these is a universal affirmative, right? So each one of these, in terms of the category, is a proposition. All S are P is the underlying categorical structure in each one. So that's a thing we're going to be able to pick up on and really use to determine whether or not a categorical syllogism is a valid argument. Okay. Now I want to talk about what is known as mood. This is a property of categorical syllogisms occurring in section B of chapter 6. And mood is pretty simple, really. Mood is just a kind of nomenclature, a naming device for what category of proposition the sentence is. So mood just consists of the type of proposition, A, E, I, or O, and the order in which they are occurring. So if we have three sentences, you will have three letters. And once you have those three letters, you have your mood, right? So it's basically a way of labeling categorical syllogisms. How do I determine the mood? Determine the category proposition type for all statements and simply list them. So to return to our example here, all M are P, all S are M, therefore all S are P. Note we broke down the category type in the last slide for each proposition, for each sentence. We determined that each one is an A proposition. So our mood has to be this, A, A, A. This is a very simple mood, right? Each sentence is identical. And now because we've really kind of mastered the four types of categorical proposition, it'll be pretty easy for us to determine the mood of any given categorical syllogism. Why do you want to know what the mood is? Well, once we apply mood to another property, we'll be able to very quickly pick up which structures of categorical syllogism are valid and which ones are not valid. So let's identify the mood for a few further examples. Here is a formalized example of a categorical syllogism. Some P are not R, some R are S, therefore all S are P. So notice we have in our first premise our major premise, and then we have our minor, and then we have our conclusion. So here we're just really focused on mood. So try to write in for yourself the categorical proposition type for each sentence to determine the mood. Now try this one. No P or M. all M are S. In conclusion, no S or P. What is the mood for? No P or M, all M are S, therefore no S or P. And here's another. Let me get out of the way for you. Some S are not M, all M are P, therefore some S are P. Our first example is OIA. The mood is OIA. Our first major premise is a particular negative, some P are not R. Our minor premise, some R are S, is an I proposition, that is a particular affirmative, and our conclusion is an A proposition, a universal affirmative. So the mood of that first argument is OIA. The second example, the mood is EAE. The first major premise is an E proposition, universal negative, no S or P, or in this instance, no P or M. The minor premise, all M are S, takes the form of a universal affirmative, all S are P. And then the conclusion is also an E proposition, a universal negative, no S or P. So the mood of the second argument is EAE. The third example, the mood is OAI. The first major premise is a particular negative. Some S are not M. That's a particular negative. The minor premise, all M are P, is an A proposition. That's a universal affirmative. And the conclusion is a particular affirmative, an I proposition. Some S or P. OAI. Okay? Mood is, in general, pretty simple, I think. You're really just taking what we already know about the underlying structure of categorical propositions and doing them 3 times per argument. Okay, so don't overthink those. And I'm not asking you to memorize, mood in terms of, any configuration or combination. We're going to be using mood to determine validity, but all you have to do to discover the mood is to label each sentence in terms of its category type. Okay, let's have a look at a few more here. I want to talk in section B also about the property known as figure. Figure is the way in which the middle term appears in a categorical syllogism. So the middle term, remember, is the class term that appears twice in the premises but does not appear at all in the conclusion. So there are essentially 4 ways in which the middle term can be arranged in categorical syllogisms. All right. The first way in which the figure can arrange the middle term is like this. We can have a major premise where the middle term appears in the subject position, and then in the minor premise, that middle term appears as the predicate term in the minor premise. In figure 2, we have the middle term appearing in the predicate position in both the major and minor premise. And in figure 3, we have the middle term appearing as the subject term in both the major and the minor premise. And then we have in figure 4, the middle term appearing as the predicate term in the major premise and the subject term in the minor premise. Whoops, sorry. So, sorry, these should all be numbered. There we go. Okay, so this is figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and figure 4. So there's only 4 possible figures, only 4 possible arrangements of the middle term, no matter what the content is in a categorical syllogism. So you might want to refer back to this on page 237 of the Baronet textbook. This gives you the full chart of figure, the 4 possible arrangements of figure. I do think it is a good idea to memorize figure, to memorize that figure 1 has this arrangement, figure 2 has the middle term arranged as in the predicate terms, figure 3 arranged in the subject terms, and figure 4 with predicate and subject terms respectively. I do think that makes doing the work of categorical logic moving forward that much easier if you can kind of have figure internalized, as it were. Okay? So try to identify the figure of this example. If we begin with this premise, no cats are mice, and then we have a minor premise, all mice are rodents, and then we have a conclusion, no cats are rodents. What is the figure of this syllogism? Remember, we're looking for the arrangement of the middle term, and there's no harm in checking back or checking on page 237 to look at the figure. First thing you want to do is identify the middle term. Where is it? Remember, it's occurring in the major and minor premise, and then look for the arrangement. This is figure 4, right? This is figure 4. We have an arrangement like this. Mice is our middle term, and mice is appearing, oop, I got a little sloppy, in the predicate term in the major premise, and the subject term in the minor premise. And that does conform if you go back to figure 4 here. Okay, middle term in predicate position and middle term in the subject position. Okay, let's look at another one. Major premise, all cheese-eating things are mammals. Minor premise, some rodents are cheese-eating things. Conclusion, some rodents are mammals. What's the figure here? Remember, first we have to identify the middle term, which term repeats in the premises but not the conclusion, and then what's the arrangement? What do we have? We have figure 1, right? This is figure 1 because our middle term is cheese-eating things. Cheese-eating things occurs in the subject position of the major premise, and it occurs as the predicate term of the minor premise. Whoop, gotta include things there. All right, that's a sloppy diagram of the figure, but we know it is figure 1. If we go back to our initial chart here, figure 1 does take this shape, middle term in subject and predicate position respectively. Okay, now here's a full chart of every possible combination we can have on both interpretations for figure and mood. In other words, these are combinations of valid categorical syllogisms when we take together mood and figure. So you'll notice, and this is occurring on page 237, we have moods like AAA figure 1 is valid, AEE figure 2 is valid, AII figure 3 is valid, and so on and so forth. So we know that from this set, for any content that takes standard categorical syllogistic form, these combinations of mood and figure are valid. We don't even have to think about the content at all. We just have to discern the mood and figure in question, and if it takes any of these combinations, it's a valid argument. We'll talk about provisional validity under the traditional interpretation, right? This has to do with an intermediate step, but note that this set on the top box is valid absolutely under both modern and traditional interpretations. Okay, so far we've kind of just gotten acquainted with the basic ingredients of categorical syllogism. Syllogisms are deductive arguments that have three sentences, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. The conclusion contains the minor and major terms, subjects and predicates, which are included in the major and minor premises. And then we have a middle term that appears in both the major and minor premise, but not the conclusion. We learned what mood is. Mood is just listing the type of category for each sentence in the syllogism, and then figure refers to the arrangement of the middle term. All right, so we're gonna keep working with these and plug away in terms of using this combination of mood and figure to identify valid and invalid categorical arguments. Thank you, everyone. Please continue with the next video.